The Shrek movie, by all accounts, was one of the strangest movies in terms of how it got from its early stages to the silver screen. And this particular video will interview some of the people who were central characters to the development of Shrek, along with myself, who was there as the first production designer. It was strange because I was working on the Prince of Egypt movie at DreamWorks, and then I was kind of plucked from that particular production, which I want to say was a very pleasurable and very smooth production, to work on something called Shrek. None of us, a bunch of us was brought into a room, maybe there were 10 of us or so. There was a group called the Propeller Heads who had developed a 3D way of making things. Now I have to tell you, this is probably 95 to the best of my memory, and 3D was a very new thing. I think Toy Story had only just been released, and the notion of making a movie out of that was particularly challenging. And this group called the Propeller Heads worked in a program called Soft Image, and they could make pretty simple 3D things. So we were handed this book called Shrek, and it's a story of this ogre, and as you can see, a very hideous character. And the group of us then didn't really have much of a script, and there's reasons for that you'll find out later. But we then proceeded to thumb through this book and began to sketch and try to develop what on earth this Shrek movie was going to be. And perhaps this might be the first drawing ever done for the Shrek movie. I was trying to envision a medieval world that the ogre lived in. And I was encouraged to do so because I was told initially that it was something that took place in medieval times and maybe around 1000 AD. I developed something sort of comical in sort of the flavor of the book. Perhaps there'd be a certain humorous quality to the production design, and a certain exaggeration to the production design, maybe even absurdity. And we began to plot along, and then plot how we were going to do it in 3D. And I'll let John Williams explain the things that happened behind the scenes before I was involved.
And I'll just go back to the bizarre thing about Shrek, which, Barry, I'm not sure even this stuff you might know or not. But originally, I'd optioned it from a book, reading the book from a bunch of library books with my kids who were 5 and 4, I think, at the time. 5 and 4, I think. And one of them was just beginning to read, but they actually turned out they'd memorized large parts of Shrek, and kind of like it was hitting a chord with them, and it seemed like, oh, that could be pretty cool. And it was the same time The Simpsons were first starting to come out, and it was kind of irreverent and kind of like, maybe there's a moment for a fractured fairy tale kind of thing. And Shrek came along. DreamWorks was just getting formed. I met with Laurie McDonald, who was the
Laurie McDonald, sure.
He ran the live action film department, and we talked about a range of things. And I gave her the Shrek book, and she came back, but and said, a few weeks later, and said they were definitely interested. But in the meantime, I'd actually gotten word that the person I'd reached out to through CAA was Henry Selick. Sure. And Henry Selick wanted to direct it, which he was the hottest animation director at that moment in time.
He would have saved us a lot of trouble, boy. I tell you, that movie went.
That would have been a very different movie.
Well,
oh my God! And ultimately, he was having troubles with Disney, and he signed a deal with Harvey Weinstein at Miramax. Henry Selick did, and then Harvey Weinstein called me. I'm actually in Montauk right now, but and he called up and said, like, I'd like to meet you because I want to do this movie, this Shrek movie. And Henry Selick, we've got Henry Selick under exclusive deal now, and we want to do this deal. And I said, okay, I'll take a train or a bus, and I'll meet you. Come in there tomorrow. He said, well, we've got a helicopter waiting for you at the East Hampton Airport, and we'll pick you up after lunch. You'll be home for dinner. And I thought, okay, that sounds fun. So we did that, and they made their offer. And then I started getting calls from DreamWorks saying, Jeffrey Katzenberg really wants to make this movie. And I said, well, look, Henry Selick is going to do the movie, and he wants it, it's going to be done at Miramax, the Weinstein Company, but became such a bizarre, and when they were highly regarded before a lot of other things happened. And then Laurie said, look, just do me the favor. He talks about this, Jeffrey talks about all the time. Please come meet with him. I came I was moving out to LA at that time from New York. And I met with him and Laurie and Penny Cox, who was also in the meeting. And they said, look, this is your movie. It'll always be your movie. This will be in production. We'll start production next week. Meanwhile, there wasn't a take. There wasn't a writer. There wasn't a full take. It was just kind of like some broad pitch comments about the tone, doing something really different and a big comedy focus to it was the purpose, and the book, which was a hint, but not much more.
I had ideas. I thought somebody like Ian Miller would be a great artist to join us because he specializes in medieval drawings, and we could get all kinds of neat looking castles and villages and things like that from his particular ink style. He's an English artist, fairly well known. That's both him and Mike Plug, who also worked on the film, was among the very first artists to do something for Shrek. And that's Ian Miller again. And I also thought the influence of the artist Red Grooms might be kind of nice, because at DreamWorks, they don't want you to come in and just design the film in your particular style. What they want you to do is pick some artists that the style of the movie would be based on. And so I thought Red Grooms would be kind of interesting because he builds kind of quirky environments, and then and builds them randomly. There's also an artist named Baron Story that I thought might be a really nice influence for the film. Artist Paul Shardlow already worked at DreamWorks, and I thought he was great. There was also a guy named Luc Demalchier and Ruben Hickman and Paul Shardlow. And so we began to develop and get direction gradually, that we were softening the look of the film a little bit so it wouldn't be too severe. This was an idea of maybe the area that Shrek came from. Ian Miller and I combined to do the first interpretation of Wart Creek, where Shrek might have a house. So we imagined it to be a swamp. It is called Wart Creek. It's described as a swamp, and we thought it would be an unpleasant sort of place. That later turned out to be, a completely different idea. We did know a little about the script, and that there was going to be a castle where a dragon lived. And so I was creating these, rather unusual, quirky, remarkable looking castles where a dragon might be guarding a princess. And then, I was told to take a more humorous look at what this castle would be like. And I began to soften it up and do various different iterations of it. I also knew that there was a kingdom that Shrek was going to go to called Duloc, and that there would be a guy there named Farquaad who would send Shrek on a mission. And the Farquaad guy would be essentially the villain of the story. And I imagined, at least at the outset, that if Shrek is this really ugly guy from the swamp, and he's this big bull in a china shop kind of character, and that he would be voiced by Chris Farley, I thought maybe the land of Duloc would be a kingdom of vanity. and would be a little bit like the Palace of Versailles, and would celebrate beauty. And so I was imagining something a little bit like this, as maybe the throne room where Farquaad would sit. None of it had been scripted out yet, so I only knew there was a place. So I imagined it would have lovely statues of Farquaad as a baby, and maybe, Farquaad as a big brave knight, all these sorts of things. The notion of him being short and diminutive came later, but initially speaking, this is what we were doing. The move, there was a movement from the execs to try to soften Shrek up and make it a little more friendly and nice. This particular illustration was by Trish Doctor. She was taking the movie a little more in a small world direction. There was also, early in the movie, there was a medieval town near where Shrek lived that he would terrorize. And it's kind of funny, if you see the first Shrek movie, that idea is in the movie for a split second. But in the beginning, though, the medieval town was a little bit more important. And now we're going to hear from one of the storyboard artists who worked on Shrek.
By the time I got to work on Shrek, it had been through, I think, like 2 at least director iterations. I think it had been a stop motion film, and then a sort of early motion capture version, and then they just decided to do it CG. But by that point, its star had faded, and the sexy film at DreamWorks at the time was The Road to El Dorado, which was being made in the swanky offices in the fancy building, and the story department for Shrek was literally under the stairs in the old training department, and it was, all the desks were busted up and the chairs were all fucked, and it was all the also-rans, all the miscreants, all the sort of the people who didn't really fit anywhere else got shoved onto Shrek, which meant that, I got put onto the Shrek story team with Chris Miller, Conrad Vernon, Cody Cameron, Tom McGrath, all these sort of people, and because we were left alone, because no one gave a shit about Shrek at that time, it got funny because we were just making ourselves laugh. And by the time, basically, the El Dorado was not working out great. It was very expensive. So Jeffrey's attention was all on Road to El Dorado. And my memory of it is that, Shrek got funny because we were basically just left alone pretty much. And by the time they kind of saw what we'd done, it was sort of pretty much too late. And it just kind of went out with this sort of weird attitude, because that was the weird attitude of the people in the story department who'd made it. But it was that weird attitude that connected with people, that made it different from all the sort of the Disney musicals and the sort of rather saccharine kind of animated fare. And I ended up getting 2 scenes in the film. I did the donkey first meeting the dragon in the castle. I did the production board for that. And then I wrote the most problematic scene in Shrek 1 was the, sort of the confessional by moonlight, where sort of Shrek finally opens up to Donkey about, why he is the way he is. And that was a scene that was always in the script. And they had, I went through.
Did you come up with the onion thing?
No, not the onion thing. That was in the script. No, but they had a version of this campfire scene where.
Yeah, I know the scene. We all know that scene.
Yeah, and it was that scene was like, there has to be some version of the scene in the film for the story to work. And they had written and rewritten that scene like hundreds of times. They had boarded and reboarded that scene, any number of times. Different artists had taken a crack at it. It just wasn't working. And it was one of those scenes that had to work. Anyway, I got given it because I think it was just like, well, fuck it. Maybe, the new guy can do. Anyway, so I rewrote the scene from what it was in the script to be pretty much what it is now in the film.
And so that was my beginning. But, I'd say, Barry, the things that I'd seen, and you worked on the on the test for Shrek, which was an interesting story for sure. And you should tell that about your J.J. Abrams and all the propeller head guys and their dimension. And J.J. Abrams, had written this feature called Regarding Henry. And I remember early on, I said to Jeffrey, I said, we should be bringing J.J. Abrams into these story meetings because he's got some really good ideas. And he did. He did have some really useful kind of ideas. We said, no, he's a tech guy. We're not going. He's not going to be in. He's not going to be on the writing thing. We don't need him. We're not going to have him.
And so it was then devised, as I continued to sketch and draw what this world would look like, that Shrek, we had to figure out what he looked like, because we were going to do a test to see if we understood the technology. And at this time, I want you to know, with soft image, and we were going to use an unknown rendering engine called Mental Ray, which none of our 3D artists had ever used before. So we were going to figure out how to make a test to show that we could indeed execute the film. The process for the test was likely overly complicated, with a lot of sculpts that would morph into one another, but it worked pretty well, and we used a certain degree of motion capture. But first we had to figure out what Shrek looked like. So all we had to go on was the book. And as you can see, there's the William Steig drawing, and in the middle is Mike Plug's interpretation. And then I did a reiteration based on a Mike Plug drawing, where we had a kind of a big, goofy kind of Shrek voiced by Chris Farley. And he would be an object of humor. He himself would be funny. So he would say funny things and do funny things and be absolutely grotesque. And like the book, the flowers would wilt when he walked by. He could potentially, swallow lightning or shoot rays out of his eyes or whatever. Those were all things that were in the book. Now, we decided the test would be that Shrek would go into a medieval town and be mugged in an alley. And he would dispose of the mugger with relative ease. And that's all the test was. But we really wanted to see, could we actually make things in 3D and possibly make this film? And so these people who were involved in the beginning of Shrek really were finding their way with 3D. They knew how to model, they knew how to do things, but there were a lot of things that they didn't know how to do. For example, I did the alley Shrek would get mugged in, and I can remember the various people saying, "Oh my God, we've never tried to do curved buildings before. We've never tried to map textures over curved buildings." So there would be the thing, Shrek would confront the mugger, and we would have the look and the whole technique of Shrek established. So step by step went by, and we always checked in with the execs on the film, and they approved the test every step of the way. And then that's the opposite view from the alley. And then we have the upshot where he shoots the mugger into the air. We also have a down shot of Shrek approaching the mugger, with the mugger leering over an edge. And now John Williams will tell you a little more about what happened on Shrek.
So it was a crazy process. There were like 4 or 5 directors that went through it, and about 4 or 5 producers who got churned through, and a very
and
rough
4 or 5
process.
production designers, I might add.
Yes, that too. But you were the original.
First one was really
and
good,
the most important. I thought Mike Plug had some really good input, even though he was a storyboard artist.
Sure.
He had some the bog and a bunch of things. The attitude of he was good.
He was good for the movie.
And there were a lot of people, and that was, I thought, the lesson of the movie was like, when you really look through it, Jeffrey had many things, and there were so many points where they were going to shut down that movie, and it was going to be over and done. And I was in those rooms when it was going around with all the executives and saying, this is just not getting air. And it was a script problem.
Writers, new directors, new producers, all coming in. there was really a lot of discord in exactly what this was supposed to be, because the book had a definite kind of look and message to it. And then there was a push to make the movie more softer, and perhaps, in my words, what I might refer to as more Disney-like in terms of its look. But there was also a push, well, it's supposed to be dark and edgy. And there was also this sort of idea of when does it take place. And, medieval times, 1000 AD was actually what I was told. And so inevitably, there became a big mess, and a lot of people pointing fingers at each other, and a lot of not really great behavior. A lot of people really did like the art that I was doing, and a lot of people liked the way the test was going and wanted to keep Shrek this really funky, dark, weird kind of movie. And there was a lot of turmoil, and they actually took the crew to a restaurant basement called the 91st Aero Squadron or something like that. And we went downstairs, and there was a psychiatrist that talked to the crew and tried to get us all to communicate honestly with one another. But that didn't work at all. If anything, it probably made it worse. And we went on with the test, but you can see that Shrek changed, and as we were doing the test, writers were then established. Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio were the writers who came in. They began to form the story as we were doing the test. And we had a variety of storyboard artists. Ken Harsha was really involved in the early test and went on to storyboard many things for Shrek. And then we had eventually a whole slew of really talented people began to work the storyboards for Shrek along with Ted and Terry. And so meanwhile, we were taking about 6 months to put this test together. And at the same time, I would also work on the various locations of Shrek. I developed the gate that Shrek walks through. What's also fun is that Photoshop was relatively new as far as using it as a commercial tool. Most people at DreamWorks were still painting with acrylic paint and things like that. And I was learning how to do texture maps and have them wrap over these curved buildings that I had designed. And I even did texture maps of Shrek and Shrek's face. And you can imagine, never having really worked on 3D or done this, it was kind of boggling for first timers to come in and see things like these textured buildings that have no lighting, and why do they look so hard edged, and why are they so unappealing. But eventually that did get worked out, and we were able to see it with full lighting and soft edges and soft shadows and all that sort of thing. So that was initially Shrek. And I know people are sometimes horrified because they're used to the movie. But you have to understand, we had not developed things that far yet. But there were rumblings that this particular Shrek was too unappealing and too ugly to be what was turning out to be a romantic story. Instead of, Chris Farley walking around knocking things over and being real vulgar and funny, it was really going to be voiced by Mike Myers, and it was going to be a softer romantic story about a big ogre who's misunderstood and eventually finds romance. So that's our job, and had created a test based on what we knew about the book. And but as is often the case, the film evolves as it goes along. Also, too, I wasn't there by the end of the test, and that I would have liked to have been closer to the art direction of it, because I think a lot of the art and shots in the test don't really live up to the art that I had done as visual development for the test. I think it's a real important thing to keep the artist on, so you can make sure that the shots that are in the test live up to the concept art. But in any event, we did the motion capture and did this. And the truth was, the crew was very, really, I think, thought that the test was remarkable considering what we knew at the beginning compared to what we actually produced. So there were a lot of people involved in making the test work. A significant one would be Rob Letterman, and anyhow, there was Brian Drucker, there was Anders Beer. There were a number of people who worked to help make that happen. And anyway, the point is that the verdict came down that they didn't think my look for Shrek was right. And so I had to leave. And I was very, very sorry about that. But it turned out that they ended up getting rid of the whole crew. I mean, everybody who was with that initial bunch got left go except for maybe one or two people. And when it was my turn to leave, the crew threw a party for me, actually, and gave me this as a present, with everybody sort of giving me a nice little note about how much they appreciated me on the development of Shrek. Because I think one thing of my characteristics is I generally say what I think is true, because I believe that artists should be really transparent and talk frankly and honestly about the state of the film and where we're at and what the complications are. But that is not a really popular way of being. It's true that very often what happens is people just clam up and they don't say anything, and they figure, if I don't say anything, I can't get in any trouble. Really a sound philosophy, by the way. I'll tell you, it's a good way to be, but it isn't in my DNA. So I tend to say what I think about where we are and what we're doing. And there was a lot of contention, because a lot of people really did like the art that I was doing, and a lot of people liked the way the test was going and wanted to keep Shrek this really funky, dark, weird kind of movie. Although at this point it was pointless to argue the point, but I still maintain that I think my look could have been very good for Shrek. Some years later, a movie named Klaus came out by Netflix, and had a design style that I thought was a lot like what I would have liked to have done for Shrek with Ian Miller. It had a quirky, distorted style, something that we very easily could have done, but it was not to be. Now, one of the most significant people to work on Shrek would be Conrad Vernon, who came up with the idea of the Gingerbread Man scene. And when he pitched this Gingerbread Man scene, by all accounts I've heard, that was where the movie finally got its feet. And people understood that Shrek is actually going to be a fairy tale. It's not really going to be about medieval times. It's going to be a fairy tale. It's going to be a softer, funnier, satirical kind of fractured fairy tale, for lack of a better word. And but that happened long after the test was finished. So perhaps the test sort of told everybody what Shrek wasn't going to be. But they worked very hard, as you can see from what Conrad has to say about it.
3 directors. Nobody wanted to work on it. It was the redheaded stepchild who lived under the stairs, and that was Shrek. And so I got onto Shrek and worked on that for like 2 years, where we were literally trying to find the story. And it was this board team hanging out in just like a story like session where we were just throwing ideas back and forth that came up. The board team came up with the whole fairy tale creature aspect and them coming to live in the swamp. And so I kind of spearheaded that and started writing my own scenes like I did when I was in TV animation. And I think on Shrek 1 and Shrek 2, which was my first directing gig, I got to write the Gingerbread Man scene for Shrek 1. and then I wrote the dinner scene and the Puss in Boots scene for Shrek 2. And the writers for Shrek, Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott, whenever they loved working with me because I would take their pages and plus them and make them sing. And then they loved coming in after and sitting down in front of my boards with me and saying, oh, I've got a better line here. And oh, maybe we could switch this around. And the writer in them would plus my boards even more. So it was always like an improving.
Also, I weirdly played the tonal part of being the relentless focus on trying to make it be a big, comedy and that dimension. And I was primarily responsible for the casting of Chris Farley, ultimately Mike Myers, who the director at the time said, I hate Mike Myers. He's exactly what I don't want. Someone who's lacks sincerity and all this stuff. And Eddie Murphy was easy, but that was a dream that was, was a comedy cast that, and Jeffrey had a long time relationship, said, if you want Eddie Murphy, we can, I'll get you Eddie Murphy or something, maybe,
Yeah.
And he did. And everyone, Mike Myers fired his, Chris Farley died in the process after 20 recordings. I was at all those recordings. And he was amazing. He was perfect. But it was a different character. But Mike Myers then came out with Austin Powers, and it gave it a license to be when he came on, which was, I was the one and only person to advocate for that, and he, it freed up the content, the tone, the writing of it to be much more irreverent, because that's what you're getting when you take on Mike Myers. You better be wanting something, kind of outlandish, irreverent, like, Wayne's World or
Yeah, sure.
Powers. It really, and I think that levitated it and freed it in a way that it might not have ever gotten there in the Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, Chris Farley version of it. And Chris Farley was funny as hell every time, and that's all I got to say.
Another 5 years after the test was finished for the movie Shrek to actually be realized. And it's kind of funny, if you look up what Shrek cost, I think there's a budget of $64 million. And I want you to know that's completely ridiculous, because they didn't really start counting the budget until they were ready to render the finished film. But the years and years spent on Shrek getting up to a point where you were ready to render the film, oh my God, you're talking about, I'm sure it cost in the area of $150 million to make that first movie. And they're very fortunate that it was a hit. It had a massive ad campaign and a lot of push to get it into the box office. And I think people were very satisfied with the film that they saw, because it is really one of the great romance movies, and has become probably one of the biggest animation franchises in history. So, but it's odd how it all began. Usually, like any work of art, you have to get a lot of the preliminary things and things that are, maybe not spot on and not really right. You get those done in the beginning, and then eventually you'll see the light, and the film will get made. But I don't fault any of the execs in the film, because they I think they could have been more transparent, but ultimately a lot of good decisions were made. It was possible to turn an ogre into really a sort of relatively attractive leading man. And they were able to sell the idea that he needed love in his life, even though he proclaimed he wanted to be left alone. And I think that resonated very, very strongly with a lot of people. And of course the craziness of the world with animated characters doing quirky and strange things fit beautifully with this unusual tale of an ogre. So I gotta say, all in all, we have to feel like that was a big success. And I didn't get the credit as production designer, but I do think I played a role in the development of the film. And we'll never know what Shrek could have been like had we gone a different direction with it. But it probably wouldn't have been as appealing to a broad range of people like the finished Shrek ended up being. But it would have cost a lot less. So, so anyway, that's the story of the origin of Shrek.